Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jim O'Donnell from Arizona State University. I have been to a fair number of Fiesole retreats. They are always a delight, and it's a privilege to be able to try to pull together a few threads from what we've been doing for the last 3 days. The only streetcar that was running in Athens yesterday was the one that our gracious host referred to as the streetcar named the future. And it has been running back and forth through this room for 3 days to the benefit of all of us. I'm going to begin by cherry picking a few observations and memorable moments, and then I have a couple of themes to extract. I'll start with a mantra that I pick up from Martina Bagnoli, who spoke of the desirability of all that we do contributing to creating an open, knowledgeable, and creative society. And you can linger on each of those 3 words and think why they are important, and I think why none of them really works unless all 3 of them work. So I have some flashes of perception and memory from these couple of days. The time my own eyebrows popped up the highest was in the course of discussion of open educational resources, when the numbers showed that the age distribution of users of open educational resources tilted much more strongly towards older users than anyone would have thought. You would have thought that OERs were for students in colleges and universities of traditional ages. They're clearly not. There's a theme in that I will come back to. Was much impressed and distracted by the discussion of linked data, bringing conservators together in handling documents, handling artifacts in ways that are now not purely local, craftspersonally, technically focused, but rather begin to enable us to think as we become more concerned about preserving the print heritage of humankind, thinking about that as a system and not simply as a collection of local chance and artifactual decisions. I loved Quinn's mention of the Museum of the Lay of Igor's campaign. I went to look for it. It's in Seversky in northeastern Ukraine. It's a real museum. It's got a real website. The good news is, on the maps that I was looking at this morning, there's more blue and less red on the landscape right around that town. But as I said in my comment yesterday to Quinn, that also doesn't matter, because using this crisis for us all to get to know that part of the world, its issues, its peoples, its cultures, better than we have before, it is a good that we are achieving through the terrible tragedy of this conflict. The fact of the physical museum and the digital museum are also a reminder that when it comes to preservation, the fragilities of material objects and the fragilities of digital objects are reciprocal and symmetrical in some ways. We need the digital to make the analog visible and in some ways to preserve it. And at the same time, we need to preserve the physical, the analogical, because we know that the digital object does not last forever. My favorite story in this regard is of the 6th century AD Latin manuscript that contained a work not otherwise known and surviving from antiquity, that was unknown throughout the Middle Ages until the year 1711. And the Italian scholar Scipio Maffei climbed up on top of a large armoire in a monastic library and found several parchment manuscripts that had been sitting there for God knows how long. Brought them down, found the texts, and edited them. No digital resource has that kind of staying power. But on the other hand, I'm really glad I now have a digital copy of that 1711 book that I can carry around and access on my iPad. But when Quinn and I had this exchange yesterday, I was much taken by a phrase of hers that I want us all to carry away with this, that an essential part of the mission of the work that she and her colleagues are doing is digital repatriation. If the territory around Seversky remains blue, then the record of the Museum of the Lay of Igor's campaign deserves to go home, both physically, virtually, in every way possible. If it does not become possible to go back to that space, then that digital repatriation can recreate essential features of that resource for the world at large in ways that couldn't have happened without the miraculous work those folks are doing. I was much taken as fellow medievalist with Maria Georgopoulou's discussion of the accidental invention of tourism. And I think there's a lesson in there for us. It's the kind of found ethnography that comes about when visitors from imperial centers go to what we now call subaltern states. And this particular one, where we're sitting today, happened to be close enough and proximate enough to non-Ottoman empires. It happened to be one that people knew about because they'd read about it for a long time, and it happened to have fabulous monuments. The Parthenon was only blown up in the late 17th century. The first travelers heading in this direction got to see the real thing, even though it was a mosque. And I was also much surprised and struck and impressed by the image she had showing the Ottoman market in the Plaka that looks exactly like the ones that are there today. I had no idea that there were "Kiss Me, I'm Ottoman" t-shirts for sale here 400 years ago, but son of a gun, there they were. I have one then consoling piece of information from these days based on one of the presentations we heard. For those of us who are of more advancing years, it is interesting and useful to know that it is possible to have your name listed as the author on a scholarly article, even if you are dead, as long as you are careful to make sure that that happens within 1 year of your death. But it's also sobering to realize that in that case, you cannot be the corresponding author. Those of us of advancing years should make a note of that and try to think how to take practical advantage of it in good time. But of course, the themes and learnings of this retreat run much deeper than those. Wilhelm Widmark and Didier Tourney agreed that the transformative agreement is far from transformative. And that raises, to me, the question of the brand of transformative agreement. Just what are we trying to expect? I'm going to come back to this theme also at the end of my remarks. But the question in my mind is, who first decided that the transformative agreement could be called a transformative agreement? In the wake of Tourney's paper, I'm thinking I should be referring to them as the cold and tepid agreements, as an equally accurate, objectively speaking, description, whatever the branding there is. Transformative agreement is a great brand for these objects, and the discussion we need to have is just what transformation we're looking for, and what time scale and what spatial scale we measure it on. But their arguments, Widmark and Tourney's, picked up a theme that ran through most of our presentations. I've got a little list. We talked about managing a digital reading room for ebooks at the Greek National Library. And we complained about the cumbersomeness of the business model that kept you limited to the number of books per person and the number of books and the deals that had to be struck with publishers. We talked about open educational resources, and the words business model recurred again. How do you fund these things? How do you sustain these things? Who should be involved? The open science presentation by Natalia was fascinating in many respects. It came down to needing a funding model, which is not quite exactly the same thing as a business model. And I'll say something there in a moment. But the distributed global library, in lieu of the totalized local collection that our host Philippos spoke about. That also expects a new business model in which you don't need to collect just in time, just in case, whichever way, multiple copies in multiple locations around the world in order to create the global library. That's bad news for publishers who depended on selling to lots of local libraries, lots of institutional libraries around the world, because that was the most efficient way to distribute information. Mounier's presentation about the weakness of the diamond business model wound up focusing on the challenges of measurement, the challenges of usage, and the challenge of scaling up something which was by nature more handcrafted, local, and idiosyncratic. and Rumi's discussion of subscribe to open. There we went back to thinking about sustainable business models. And then again, Vidmark and Torney talking about the business models of transformative. And this morning, in Raza's presentation, we had discussion, very interesting to me, of the way in which some business models are already fraying, that the freemium business model doesn't look like it's got a long-term future, and the embargo business model doesn't look like it has a long-term future. The freemiums go away because getting a free PDF thrown in when you pay for the book is not so important when what you really want is just the free PDF, and sales of the physical book fade. When the embargo, if expecting materials to be for sale for a year and then made freely open, doesn't work so well when just-in-time book buying pushes sales into year 2 and year 3 and year 5 going forward. Business model. What is a business model? I'm going to suggest that it is a shorthand for a limited and inevitably ineffective in itself intervention in a larger social ecosystem. And Lisa, about half an hour ago, I looked at my notes and said, should I be replacing the word ecosystem with something else? And I'm not doing that for a reason that I will talk about again in a moment. But it's an ecosystem that requires economic intervention in order to motivate and manage cooperation and collaboration. That's why a funding model isn't quite a business model. In a funding model environment, you go to one source of imperial or governmental or non-governmental privilege. Somebody I know just gets to be president of a foundation that's got a $7.7 billion endowment. When I saw that news, I remembered Vartan Gregorian's famous words when he went from Brown University to the Carnegie Corporation and said, now that I am a donor, I see indeed that it is truly more blessed to give than to receive, or at least more fun. But the business model is a hopeful description. It's a hypothesis for the future. If we do this, if we make these financial incentives work in this particular way, then other good things will and should follow somewhere coming beyond that. And maybe it will work and maybe it won't. We've spent a lot of time in these 3 days preoccupied with the hydraulics, the plumbing, the mechanics of business models, and which ones will work and which ones won't. But a business model is not a magic pill. So I'm going to go back to the ecosystem word by referring to the open science discussion where Natalia Manolo was refreshingly frank about the limits of societal support in critical areas advancing something of high value to the society. Certainly in this room, I think we would all agree that funding open science is a really good thing for the government of Greece to do. And as I say that, you can hear Leah's remark off to one side of, you have to wait for a change of government. And then she said the government will change again. And the stability and reliability of the funding model will be in challenge. But that is simple by comparison to the complexity that's brought together when we're talking about something as a business model where money has to change hands in multiple ways for the benefit of multiple stakeholders in order to put together a mechanism that can sustain something of high value to society. But once you recognize that the funding model is challenged by the political model, I think you are dealing with an ecosystem. And I choose ecosystem to mean a system in which interventions very often bring unexpected consequences. The old joke is you don't mess with Mother Nature because Mother Nature has ways of coming back and messing with you. I was shocked this morning to see that they had 7 inches of rain at Bondi Beach in Sydney yesterday. This is the 3rd major flooding episode in Sydney, Australia in the last month or 6 weeks, something like that. Pretty good evidence we've messed with Mother Nature and her ecosystem is coming back for us. If we're going to make it an urban landscape, Lisa, and here's what I was thinking about, at least it has to be a Jane Jacobsy landscape in which you are aware of the fact that if you bulldoze a freeway through Washington Square, lots of other bad things are going to happen and lots of other consequences are going to have to be dealt with besides the swoosh of traffic through lower New York. I'm also thinking now of the description of Subscribe to Open by Anne Rumi yesterday afternoon, where the model was attractive to mathematicians because they really hated APCs. And it was attractive to astronomers because they have a culture already of practicing green open access to so considerable an extent that moving towards an APC model just wouldn't make sense. They would say, I've put it out there open access already, why should I pay again to do that? But she admitted that she was unsure whether that model could sustain. And that's not a technology question. It's not a money question. It's a question about the ecosystems of various, diverse, scientific, and scholarly communities, which all look alike in one respect and are very, very different from each other in other respects. Will Subscribe to Open make sense in context? Will it make sense broadly? Will it make sense 1 or 5 years from now? Those are questions about people and their idiosyncratic and often unpredictable choices, not about numbers. I took consolation from the discussion here that Subscribe to Open initiatives, notably Scope 3, seem to be holding together, that the free rider problem is not accelerating, is not increasing. But we only have a few years of experience with them now. We don't know what happens the next time mighty budget crunches come around to universities in the next great global economic crisis. We don't know what happens when the next boom in China, for example, grows many more new universities who happily accept all the Subscribe to Open free content that's being handed to them and don't make any contribution to that environment. And there is a case we've been discussing in the States of a university which has recently been refusing to engage in Subscribe to Open and pulling out of Subscribe to Open initiatives when offered the chance on the high moral ground, which I happen to disagree with, but it's a high moral ground, that they are a public institution which should only be spending public resources where it is necessary to do so for the good of the institution and the community, and contributing to a greater good than that of the community that puts those resources together is not an appropriate way to spend money. Okay, at that point, we're beginning to talk about ethical issues, we're beginning to talk about political issues, and we're addressing an ecosystem of subscribing to open, which is still very much up in the air and of dubious future. I don't mean dubious in the sense that in a negative sense, but of doubtful future. We just don't know where we will go. In that vein, when I came this morning with these notes already drawn up, I was struck in Roz Pine's discussion by her beginning the discussion of open access and humanities manuscripts with the first bullet across the slide was culture and trust. That's where open access in the humanities needs to begin. That's where open access in the humanities will flourish. And things are changing. I have two things are changings from very recently this morning that you will not need reminding of, but I will remind you anyway. Mike Taylor's discussion that one of the features of interactions with OA journals is that the interactors, the users, the citers, the readers, run far beyond the domain of professional scholars to a much wider audience. This is what I was seeing already yesterday in the discussion of open educational resources, going to persons of unknown provenance and advancing years whom you wouldn't expect to be in the primary audience. 5 years from now, 10 years from now, open educational resource people will have discovered that they're preparing materials for different kinds of audiences, different kinds of pedagogies, different kinds of uses in one way or another. And of course, Toby Green's presentation as a whole is about that new ecosystem in the wild. I spent a little time looking up Kamil Guleyev's Twitter feeds this morning. I'm very interested in the Ukrainian situation. And darn, they're good. They're interesting. He, if it's a he, probably doesn't much care whether they're around in 5 years, doesn't much care whether they are part of the scholarly record, because the purpose of those tweets is to change minds now and change lots of minds now and not merely change the minds of the community of scholars. Once upon a time, 1665, let's call it, it made more sense to think that if you wanted to speak to and with the most influential communities of people who knew things, libraries were the way to reach that kind of audience. A scholarly record and the mechanisms created in libraries were the place and the means for achieving that readership, which was the essential and the primary readership. It was a necessary and almost sufficient condition. In a world that is plagued by the lies we call fake news, reaching a broader audience immediately, like 10 minutes ago, like this morning, like right now, is obviously critical for the health and well-being of the society in which this knowledge is being created and distributed, and a little bit devil take the hindmost. I'm reassured that Quinn and her colleagues arise from a library community. I'm delighted they're scrambling as fast as they can, and at least that piece of collection and archiving of the informal world will probably get taken to the world of a more permanent record in ways that other things might not. But take Stephen Rentut's point of a few minutes ago. We are all talking about a lot of gray literature. We live in a world of gray literature. We live on our bookmarks and our links and the sites we visit on a regular basis, even if we can't go back to them. And I'll take you to the limit case of that. I won't ask for a show of hands of how many of you use Facebook and then how many of you hate Facebook. I expect all the same hands to go up for both of those. But Facebook's refusal to make it possible to dig back through the archive and find that Facebook posting from somebody else of 2 or 3 days ago. You can go and look at your own Facebook postings back to the dawn of time, but it's painful. But you can't go back and look at anybody else's Facebook postings to the dawn of time. You can't search, you can't find. It's an environment designed to be evanescent, to disappear, and to have its impact right now, here and now. And it's made Zuckerberg how rich? What's his motivation for providing a somewhat more robust format? What's his motivation for providing metadata? Toby, get us some metadata. Mr. Zuckerberg isn't going to do that stuff anytime soon. I'm going to close, nevertheless, with a little bit of optimism. I've been struck in the course of yesterday's conversations particularly by the number of people who prefaced a discussion of open access by saying how long we've been working on open access. The numbers I heard yesterday were 10 years, young people, what do you know? 15 years and 20 years. I will be a grizzled veteran and say that it was 27 years ago that Ann Okerson and I published what I believe is the first book on open access ever published, and the first book ever compiled out of a listserv discussion by serious and important people, scholarly publishing at the crosswords, A Subversive Proposal. The issues were hot and real and live then, framed differently. The experiments that we've lived through now had not yet taken place, but I will crow slightly myself and say that at that point I had been an open access online academic publisher for 5 years myself. I still am with our Bryn Mawr Classical Review Journal. We've been forming this movement for a very long time. Ecosystems don't change rapidly. They don't change instantaneously. They are large and heavy and difficult to move when the unintended consequences slow you down. Difficult time for change. Wilhelm Widmark, who's been a leader in transformative agreements in scholarly publishing, is impatient and has his chart of all the countries that aren't there where Sweden is yet. Me, I was sitting here saying, darn, Sweden, look at those folks go. And look at all those dials he had on that slide. None of them are back at 0 or 1% or 2%, and the movement is continuing in a direction. We don't know how long it will take. We don't know what tipping points we will come to. The Ithaca report statistics that Lisa was showing us a while ago suggest that the mid-20 teens were a time of some remarkable change, and we don't have the numbers yet for what the pandemic and the drive to the use of digital information of the pandemic can and will bring us. There may very well be tipping points coming soon at which some of these numbers change quite suddenly and quite remarkably. So I'll end with our gracious host's metaphor again. Streetcars are not noted for their speed. There was mention of Ferraris otherwise. Okay, you young people can go get your Ferraris if you want to. A certain number of them are going to get wrapped around light poles before you get to where you're going. Streetcars are not renowned for their speed, but they can be a very good way to get where you're going. It's been a great pleasure to be here on the streetcar ride with all of you. I want to thank the speakers, congratulate them for their presentations, to thank Anne and Michele and, of course, Becky for their organization and structure and design of this event. Thank all of us for still being alive and here in 2022 to come to the 2020 Fiesole retreat, slightly postponed. And Becky, do we know where next year is yet? Here we come to talk about that. Aha, okay. Wait till next year when the streetcar starts up again. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for your patience now.